what we look at is writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. And so from the beginning of writing, right, so 3,000 or 4,000 BC, we're around 2000 AD, 4,200. That's around 5,000 or 6,000 years of recorded history.
Long before America came to exist.
Right. But in a sense, 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. We've all met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it, maybe a grandmother. We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. But during this time, what type of governments are there? Well, believe it or not, the most common form of government is a king. Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, Maharaja, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun. Every generation, power wants to concentrate into the hands of one person. And I think it goes back to the fall in the garden and Cain killing Abel and selfishness coming into the human DNA and one king taking a kingdom from another king. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others, put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball, put some junior high girls in a clique, one of them's a diva, put some people in the woods, one of them's the Indian chief, put them in the inner city, one of them's the gang leader. So it's sort of the Lord of the Rings. Everyone wants this ring of power.
So groups of people tend to elect one person as the all-powerful.
Well, not necessarily elect. It's the first invention ever was the plow. And then, Cain was a tiller of the soil. Then people started hitting each other with it. And then they turned into weapons. And then people gravitated together for protection. And it formed cities. And usually when you get people together, someone's better at fighting off the enemy, and you make him the captain. And then this person has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class, and it turns into a hereditary monarchy. And so the most common form of government's a king. And like that Fibonacci sequence, if you're familiar with the Nautilus shell and how it starts with a little turn, then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, like water going down a drain or a hurricane or a galaxy. It's this spinning. And so if you look at it, you go from Cain killing Abel to the Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and the Egyptian pharaohs and Cyrus of Persia and then Alexander the Great, and then the Roman emperors, and then Attila the Hun and the Byzantine emperors and the Muslim sultans and the Mongolian Genghis Khan, and then you get these maritime empires of Spain, France, Austria. But the largest empire that the planet had seen was the King of England. He had this global empire. Now, clearly, there's a global goal in mind that still may be what's in the future, but nevertheless, at the time our country was founded, America's founders didn't like the king thing. And so when they got the chance, they wanted to set up a government as far away from a king as possible. So they flipped it and made the people the king. So a republic is the people are king ruling through their representatives.
This is the punchline of your book, is that America is different. When you say who is king in America, America is essentially the first set of constitutional government in world history that doesn't have a real king. Although we elect a president, he's certainly not all-powerful.
Well, it's the biggest and most recent, but America's founders did look back to some previous examples. The Roman Republic, which went on for about 527 BC to 45 BC until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself dictator for life.
And he fired the Senate, essentially.
Right. And then they look back to ancient Greece, which had a democracy from about 500 to 300 BC until Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, found out that he could bribe citizens of Athens with money under the table, and they would betray their own city, and then Philip could conquer it. But America's founders ultimately looked back to ancient Israel. So lo and behold, 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, and they're in the Promised Land. For those first 400 years, there is no king. This is the first instance in world history of an entire nation with no king. So at this time, Egypt had 2,000 years of pharaohs. China had 5,000 years of emperors. India had Maharajas, right? Raja means king and Maha means great. You had the kings of Og and Bashan, in Mesopotamia. So when the children of Israel come into the Promised Land, there's no king. They go from being a slave people and come out as a mob, and suddenly they get the most unique form of government that the planet has ever seen. And when we examine it, there's some very unique things. One of them is where there's a king. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. When Israel comes into the Promised Land, for 400 years there's no king, And the law specifically says there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone is to be treated the same, male, female, made in the image of the Creator.
Equality is a novel concept, and it is biblical.
So America decided they didn't like the King of England controlling their lives, and so they flip it and make the people the king. So a republic is the people are king ruling through their representatives. A democracy is the people are king ruling directly. So a democracy only ever worked on a citywide level, like Athens. Once it got larger than a city, it fell apart. A republic is you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market and talks politics every day. They're your representatives. So we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. You're basically pledging allegiance to you being in charge. Right? You're not pledging allegiance to a king's crest. It's a flag with 50 stars representing the 50 states, representing the people within the states.
The people are in charge, not strictly democratic, but as a republic and not as a monarchy.
Correct. So where did the founders get this idea? Ancient Israel is the first instance of a nation ruled without a king. Now let's look at it. Israel is also the first nation with private land ownership. You see, wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It is always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he will take away the land and kill you. In Israel, the land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it, every 50 years it reverted back to the family. This prevented a dictator from gathering up the land and putting the people into slavery. If you can own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist, right? But the idea is promised land, the people owned it.
Property rights.
Property rights. Second is ancient Israel is the first nation with no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia and armed and ready at a moment's notice to defend his family and his community. Ancient Israel had no prisons, like Joseph wasting away in Egypt in prison. Well, in Israel, the law says when a crime's committed, you have immediate justice at the gate of the city. You have the trial right then and there. And then a city of refuge you could run away to await a trial. Ancient Israel is the first nation where they had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. So in Egypt, people were selling their souls to the Pharaoh for a handout of grain. In Israel, when somebody harvested their land, they left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out to those who can help them stay in power.
But the poor still had to work by picking up the gleanings for themselves, at least.
Correct. And so we begin to see some uniqueness with Israel. And they had no police. Because everyone was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. And so everybody was deputized, so to speak. Ancient Israel got to choose their own leaders. Moses said, how can I alone rule? He says, take you wise men known among your tribes. Bring them to me, and I'll recognize them as your leaders. This was an election process. And then I found this interesting. Ancient Israel is the first nation where everyone could read. I think, really? Yeah. In Mesopotamia, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters. I don't know about you, but memorizing 1,500 anythings is not fun.
It's not like 26 letters in our alphabet.
Right, and so it was only for kings and scribes. The first invention ever was the plow, right? People hit each other with it, they gravitated together, and somebody rescued him, and he became the king, and this hereditary. And so the kings wanted to count everything they owned. So China invented a way of counting with knots and ropes. And then in Sumeria, they had an abacus, rods and beads sliding back and forth. And then they had tokens in little dishes, right? And then they made markings in the tokens, sort of like tallying 1, 2, 3, 4, and a line across for 5. That was the beginning of writing.
And mathematics.
And mathematics. And it was only for the kings and the scribes. The common people didn't read. In Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphs. It was the scribes' secret knowledge. They kept them complicated on purpose as job security. When Moses came down the mountain, he did not just have the law. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet. So easy to learn, even children could learn how to read. Ancient Israel is the first instance where the entire populace could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read because the law was addressed to each person. He says he gives you land, don't do what he says, he kills you, right? So one side of the spectrum is total government. The other side is no government. That would be anarchy unless the people had internal morals. It's like everybody's running a behavioral software app on their phone. Instead of GPS telling you where to turn, it tells you how to act, what to say, right? To interpersonal relationships. But wait a second, why would you follow an internal moral? Why would you follow an internal moral set of code? Ancient Israel introduced the necessary ingredient. A God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He will hold you accountable in the future.
So let me recap this. You either have totalitarian governments, dictators telling the people how to behave, or the people govern themselves, but the only way a free people are willing to govern themselves morally is if they're afraid of God's consequences for their misbehavior.
Right. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there is no virtue because there is no prompting of the conscience. And first House chaplain was William Lynn. He says, let my neighbor once persuade himself that there is no God, and he will soon pick my pocket and break not only my leg, but my neck. If there's no God, there's no future account. Right? And so the idea is, if everybody in the country believes God is watching me, he wants me to be fair, he will hold me accountable, everybody's motivated to follow these internal morals. And the God of the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Even the stranger living amongst you is under the same law that you're under. So, Israel's system, the priests stop teaching the law, every man did what was right in their own eyes, turns into chaos, and they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, we want to be like all the other countries, we want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they did not reject you, they rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So, America's founders looked to that. How? Well, after the Renaissance, late 1400s, there's the Reformation, 1517, and then there's a Hebrew revival from the 1580s up until the Age of Enlightenment in the early 1600s. What's this Hebrew revival? You have all the scholars in Europe, John Higginson, John Selden, John Locke, Hugo Grotius, they're studying this Hebrew Republic. And that's the time that America's colonies were founded, right? And so we begin to see that they look back to this. One interesting thing is the U.S. Constitution was written, but it needed to be ratified by the states. They needed 9 states. They had 8. New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th, but it was in a deadlock. They postponed the convention. They have a day of fasting. They get back together. And the Harvard president, Samuel Langdon, gives an address to the delegates titled The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States. Instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 colonies of the American Union and see this application plainly. After his sermon, they vote and they ratify it. They're the 9th state. The U.S. Constitution goes into effect.
And they base that on the Israeli model.
Right. So, America, the Muslims conquered into Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, makes a deal with the Protestants called the Peace of Augsburg so they can have a united front against the Islamic invasion. And in his treaty, he says, whatever the king believed, the kingdom has to believe. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslim invaders. And so the different kings believe different things. If you didn't believe the way your king did, you were persecuted, you fled. Mass migration of people in Europe, they spill over and found colonies. And so I read through every colony. Each one was founded by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican, Massachusetts was Puritan, Rhode Island was Baptist, New York was Dutch Reformed. You get the picture. They didn't get along. They chased each other out, but then they had to work together against the King of England during the Revolution. But we look at it. When there's the colonists would come over, there were originally 3 types of colonies. A company colony, the Virginia Company. The king approved the bylaws. There was a royal colony where the king sent over a governor. And there's a proprietary colony where the king gives the whole thing to some friend as property. But the king's in charge of them all. When the Pilgrims were going to land in Virginia, they got blown off course to Massachusetts. It's just a beach. And they go, there's no king-appointed person on our boat. Who is going to be in charge? So they do something revolutionary. They give themselves the authority to start a government, and then they all agree to follow the laws that they pass. Simple, revolutionary, because the whole rest of the world is this divine right of kings. The king gives the power to his, God gives it to the king, he dispenses it to the people. And in America, it's this idea that, no, God gives the rights to the people, and we amongst ourselves choose our leaders, so it percolates from the bottom up. It's a difference between a dead pyramid and a living oak tree with every root sucking nutrients. Every little cell participates in keeping it alive. And so, the Pilgrims do the Mayflower Compact. We covenant together in the presence of God to create a civil body politic and agree to render all due submission to the laws we pass. Where did they figure this out? From their pastor, John Robinson, one of the founders of the Congregational denomination. And then we see that New England is where this experiment takes place. These different pastors and their churches are founding communities. Roger Williams founds Providence, Rhode Island. Thomas Hooker founds Hartford, Connecticut. There's Thomas Hooker. The Puritans in Massachusetts are strict, and so he leaves. And then they found Hartford. His church members say, how do we do the government? And he says, he gives a sermon, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. So to solve your question, who's the king in America? The people. Who are the counselors to the king? 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian, which means they're going to church at least every now and then, which makes the pastors of America counselors to the king. And so you have two types
Bingo.
of counselors.
I love it.
One type of counselor tells the king to sleep, shirk your responsibility. Another comes in and throws a bucket of ice water on his congregation and says, wake up. You don't just have the right to vote in America. You're going to be held accountable to God for what happens.
Wonderful. Now, the pastors are counselors to the people who are the king, ultimately the sovereign, because the churches need to participate in elections.
Right. Have you ever seen the movie The Lord of the Rings? And there's this scene of a King Theoden, and he has a spell cast on him. Gray hair, gray eyes, cataracts. He's decrepit in his throne. And he has two counselors in this scene. One is an ugly guy named Wormtongue who's whispering in his ear saying, stay asleep, don't wake up. Yes, your kingdom is being overrun, but just wait a little longer and it's all going to be over. And another counselor comes in named Gandalf, and he casts the devil out of him. And right before your eyes, the king starts to wake up, and his eyes get clear, his hair gets short. He looks around the room, and he says, dark have been my dreams of late. It's like, yeah, you've been out of it with this spell cast on you. And so they said, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. And so here in America, the people are the king, but they've been under a spell. They've been asleep, and they've got Wormtongue type of pastors that are saying, don't shirk your responsibility.
Go back to
you're
sleep.
The king, right? Romans 13, every authority is set up by God. God allowed our founders to set it up so the people are the king. Another set of pastors comes in and, like Gandalf, cast the devil out and say, wake up, you're in charge. Martin Luther King Jr.